Brian, how did you get involved in journalism? What started you?
I was thinking about that the other day, and I can't remember why I got into journalism. It wasn't my goal originally. It wasn't my plan. My plan was to go to university and become a teacher. And that didn't pan out, and there was some interest in radio. So I grew up listening to CHML in Hamilton, and there was a news talk station there. Remember some of the great characters from that. And I said, okay, well, I'll do that, and then after I finish the program there, I'll go on and complete a degree and become a teacher. That part never happened. But I did finish the program at Mohawk in broadcast journalism. Parted around for a few years because I graduated in the middle of the recession in the early 90s. No jobs, so puttered around for a bit. And then a gentleman that I'd met working in Ottawa, I ended up in Ottawa, and the two of us were working there, and he went back to help launch a new radio station in Montreal. He called me up a few months after they'd started and said, we're having trouble getting reporters to have a clue. Can you come down and join us? And I hemmed and hawed and eventually went down and spent a couple years in Montreal, despite not being bilingual, reporting on the Parti Québécois from PQ headquarters and not being bilingual, understanding part of what they said, being able to read, pick up the inferences, and...
High school French?
High school French.
Is that it?
Yeah, grade 10 French, and grade 10 French that ended when Sister Mary Holowati said, I'll let you pass if you promise not to take it again next year. That's how good my French was. But I ended up having a nose for political journalism and picking out stories that other people were missing.
Did you have an ideology already formed to prevent you from being indoctrinated to the left, which is what most of the journalist schools today seem to be indoctrinating their students into? Well,
back then I was on the left.
Were you?
Until I went and lived in the socialist utopia of Quebec, I was still on the left. If CBC and the Toronto Star said it, it was probably true. And then and they had always said how wonderful Quebec's social workers' paradise was. And then I went and lived there.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of people think, well, you didn't like living in Quebec because of the language thing. No, actually, for the most part, that wasn't a big issue while I was there. Sure, there were second cups being firebombed, and sure, there was always talk of tightening language laws, and sure, they were always trying to stop somebody else from going to an English school. But that was usual.
Mm-hmm.
It was the other things of how far-reaching government control of everyday life was that woke me up. And I've started reading people like David Frum, who back then was still fairly conservative, and Mark Stein, and saying, you know what, these guys are making more sense. And the reason I was reading them was, the Post was a couple years old then, and on my subway ride home, I'd try and grab a paper. Well, everybody, by the end of the day in a newsroom, everyone's rifled through all the papers, but the Post was always left there because journalists don't want to read the Post. It's not left-wing enough, so all the other papers are gone. I'd grab the Post, and eventually I thought, these guys are making sense. They're making more sense than what I'm seeing going on around me. And there was a gradual shift in my politics as I thought about things for myself instead of being on the default left.
Did you find once you changed your ideology, did that make it difficult for you to get work?
No, because I was working in talk radio, which is the part of the media that the rest of the media hates anyway, and they just assume that you're all rabid right-wingers. So as I was making this transition, and it was a process, it took a while to think things through, I moved from Montreal to Ottawa to work at 580 CFRA with people like Steve Madeley, Lowell Green, who are well known in the nation's capital, and both definitely conservative. So I became the morning reporter there. And so I just come from Montreal, where half the Chrétien cabinet were MPs. I'm originally from Hamilton, where Sheila Copps was the ward boss. I had great Liberal contacts, and then I moved to Ottawa, and because of where I worked, Liberals didn't want to talk to me, and I found it very bizarre. And again, this is all part of the ongoing process of my transformation. No, I didn't have trouble getting work at all in this. What What struck me, though, was that as I was changing, that helped me still pick up on more stories that other people were missing, because a lot of young journalists, well, not only are they default left, but then they get into the business and they're told to go cover City Hall or something like that, and they don't get why everyone's angry that their taxes are going up, because they don't pay taxes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're just getting used to paying taxes, and so, hey, they've got a paycheck, they can go out Friday night, they don't care. But when you're married, like I was, when you've got kids, like I did, when you're paying taxes, that's when you start to be bothered by these sorts of things.
Now you're with Sun News Network,
Mm-hmm.
host of Byline. There's a bit of controversy with Sun now trying to, with their new licensing scheme, to be on cable.
Yeah, we want to be on basic cable.
On basic cable, and some people are calling Sun News Network hypocritical.
Look, it's not our first choice to go this route. And in a perfect world, the perfect world that Andrew Coyne lives in, which exists only in Andrew's head, we wouldn't have to do this because we'd be a market-based system. But in Canada, we are so far from a free market system
Mm-hmm.
that we can't even see a free market.
If you want to play the game, you got to play by their rules, more or less.
Yeah, so we went out and we tried the free market route of trying to talk to the cable companies and saying, will you have us on? It was very low price that we were asking. They didn't want to talk to us. Not only, so people could not order if they wanted it.
Mm-hmm.
We mounted pressure campaigns. That didn't work. So at that point we said, okay, let's go back and see if we can change this another way. We live in a system where the power is concentrated in a few hands, and they all try and screw each other. Let's not mince words. They try and screw each other. And so it's about politics. It's partisan politics at the provincial or the federal level in terms of parties. They may not like our political point of view. It's also business politics of, well, we don't like your company because your channel, we have to carry at this and blah, blah, and you won't give our channels preferential treatment. So there's games played all over the place. We're playing within the system that exists.
Right, and of course right into the center of it is the government and the CRTC, and you have to jump through a lot of hurdles there, and it's quite a tangled web. So it's almost impossible for, I would suggest, almost impossible for a startup company to survive when all of your competitors are in bed with the government and the CRTC, like you're explaining in your book about the CBC, how they're in bed with the CRTC regulators. You almost have to play their game to exist.
Yeah, and people have said, well, why don't you just let us buy a web stream feed, and we'll watch that way, and we don't have to deal with the cable companies. There's a gentleman in the States that has done that with a company called The Blaze, Glenn Beck. If we did that, we would be in trouble with the CRTC in trying to get the cable companies on board with us. They'd say, well, why would we work with you? You're getting that. We don't, again, we're back to the point of not having a free market system in Canada. And so we're playing within the rules that exist. Would we prefer something else? Sure.
As long as everybody else played by those rules too.
Yeah, and look, both myself, people higher up in the company have called for the end to a lot of the subsidies that exist, even though we're benefiting from them. We've said, eliminate this. But if we're having to pay into them, and then they're dispersed to our competitors, of course, the company's going to take them as well. But at the same time, we've said, eliminate these things. They shouldn't exist. But again, so far from a free market system, we can't see it. We wouldn't recognize it if it walked up and kicked us in the shins.
You mentioned Glenn Beck and The Blaze, and there's PJ
Media?
PJ Media as well, and all those who are trying to do an end run around the mainstream media. And are doing quite successful at it as well. How has the internet affected journalism today? Do you really... Well, for example, I get most of my news from the internet. I don't watch TV. I watch you on TV via the internet sometimes. You know, I pick up your show. I pick up Glenn Beck. I'll watch what I want when I want it. How has the internet affected journalism, the back end of it, the foundation of journalism?
Well, I'll tell you, it's both a blessing and a curse, like so many things. It is a curse in the sense that instead of years ago when you'd have deadlines a couple of times a day, it's now constant. So everybody's in a rush to get the story out, get it up first. Because if you get it up first, then it spreads via the internet, and it's on Facebook, and it's on Twitter, and everyone reads your version. So the editors are now. That doesn't give people as much time as they used to have when a report comes out to read the report properly, digest it, get reaction, and write a story. You've got to get it, you've got to report on it, then you've got to go back and do all the backfill.
It sounds like Rush Limbaugh's drive-by media.
So I quite often I do have sympathy for reporters who are in those situations. A lot of people will say, well, you made mistakes, you're an idiot. Quite often they just didn't have the time, and they've got to match everybody else. So everybody's under the gun that way. I'm not saying that's the reason for all the mistakes that are out there, but when there's breaking news, that's a good part of why there are so often mistakes. Mm-hmm. The blessing part is that you can pick up an audience everywhere. And so while I was on Parliament Hill working for Astral Radio, CJBK here in London, CFRB in Toronto, CJD in Montreal, I started posting my thoughts on the blog. I started posting my stories elsewhere. Was able to gain a much more diverse audience going that way. And that's carried over on Sun.
You have a very popular blog, Lilley's Pad.
Yeah. And so I now have a good following in the United States based on some of the things that I've said about gun control. Mm-hmm. Americans have taken notice and said, this guy knows what he's talking about. They're having a fight over their Second Amendment. It's a compliment, I think, to have these guys saying, this fellow knows what he's talking about. Listen to him on gun control. So it changes where your audience comes from. You're not limited in terms of geography.
That's right. As a matter of fact, you have a sort of an endorsement on the back of your new book, CBC Exposed, by Glenn Beck, I see.
Yeah, so, Ezra Levant and Michael Corrin, who both work with me.
Mm-hmm.
Glenn, who I met a little while ago, and we've appeared on each other's shows several times now after hitting it off. So, yeah, it's come about through that.
The internet as well is a great source for those news items that the mainstream media don't carry. For example, with the Caledonia affair, you've had people like Gary McHale, Mark Vandermoss for years now trying to get the OPP to obey the law. Mm-hmm. And the mainstream media are not picking it up. Gary and Mark are on the internet pushing this item. Sun has picked up on it. What's the problem out there with the mainstream media that they don't want to touch some things, like the OPP's failure to uphold the law?
Before I get into that, let me just say that the blogs are a great source of news, and so I try and credit them. Newspapers don't always like to give credit to blogs when they pilfer stories, which they do all the time. Mm-hmm. Stories will break on a blog and they'll do it. I try and give credit. Sometimes you forget that you saw it first on a blog, but on air I try and give hat tips and shout outs, because they do so much great work of digging up things. But the Caledonia issues baffled me for a long time. For several years, my dad lived in Caledonia, owned the original house, the McKinnon House in Caledonia, which was very first house built on the Grand River, overlooked the dam and the railway tracks that run through town. And back then, back in the 80s and 90s, everyone got along. There wasn't the problems that are there now. And we were out on when I was visiting him, I'd be out on the reserve pretty much every time we went. Either going shopping, there were a couple of stores in there. People would go to get gas, because everyone goes to the reserve to get gas because it's cheaper.
Gas and cigarettes, of course.
Yeah. No, we weren't interested in the cigarettes, but we liked the gas. And he worked with a bunch of guys that were out there. He's a Boilermaker, and there's a lot of iron workers on the reserve, and there were no problems like that. And then the event with Douglas Estates happened, and it just shocked me. So there was, I was watching from Ottawa, and there was huge media coverage at the beginning as they're tearing down hydro stands and all of this, but
burning bridges.
Yeah, and then it went away. I think part of it has to be that the government wasn't saying a whole lot, the OPP wasn't saying a whole lot, and the opposition parties let it happen and did not hold the government to account. And I do know that CHCH Television out of Hamilton did a fair bit of coverage of the OPP not doing things properly. I know in Christy Blatchford's book, their reports are mentioned several times, but they're real close to it. The rest of the media, they lost interest after the dramatic footage went away. CHCH actually had a cameraman attacked.
Yeah, it is.
Their tape taken away. So they cared about it for a while, but after a while, nobody cared. And then, I'm sorry, I forget his last name, but Sam, I believe was his first name, the gentleman who was attacked building a home.
Right, yes. Who suffered brain damage.
Suffered brain damage. I spoke to his brother on the show some time ago. That brought some attention back to it, but a lot of people in the media dropped the ball on that, but so did the politicians. People have pointed to the feds and said, well, it's their fault. Actually, it's not, because that land is not part of any land claim.
No, it was given to the tribe, as I understand it, from the United States. When they came over, they gave them this land.
Yeah, but then it was sold off a long time ago. It is not part of any official land claim. And therefore, any law breaking that happens is municipal or provincial jurisdiction. So the feds can get involved and say, if there's a land claim, let's deal with this. But they can't send in the RCMP to police that area. That's up to the province. And Dalton McGuinty allowed an armed insurrection to go on territory that he was supposed to be the leader of for, 2006, and then he resigned last fall. So for 6.5 years, he allowed this to happen. And the opposition let him get away with it.
There was no opposition.
And then the voters rewarded him.
Yes.
Because that happened in 2006, and he got a majority again in 2007. And
do you think if it had been covered more in depth, that the public would have turned against McGuinty more than, and probably outed him the second time around?
I mean, well, it might have. I have to give kudos to Christina Blizzard, who's our Sun columnist at Queen's Park. She's written about this several times and has brought it back when nobody else has been talking about it, and there's no interest. So I don't know. I think part of the blame for that has to rest with the politicians.
Your thoughts on the OPP themselves? They refused to uphold the law in Caledonia.
Mm-hmm.
They're now refusing, or have refused in the past when Idle No More was active, to disband the protests under court order. They disobeyed the court. In fact, they even joined in on the protests themselves.
Well, that was actually Sarnia.
In Sarnia, yes.
In the one with that was Sarnia Municipal Police.
Oh, the municipal police?
Yeah, that was the municipal police that was drumming while they were supposed to be enforcing a court order.
In Caledonia, the OPP actually helped the Indian protesters erect a barrier.
Yeah, and I've seen that footage, and I've heard the words of Chris Lewis, and I've publicly called for Chris Lewis to resign and run for a seat. He is acting as a politician.
The OPP chief.
The OPP commissioner is acting like a politician, just like a man that he somewhat reports to, but who also reports to the feds, OPP Superintendent Chris Wyatt, who's the chief firearms officer. These guys, both of them, are making up their own law. They're making up their own law. They're refusing to enforce laws that exist. They should resign and run for office. The police do not make the law. They enforce the law. And when a judge says, do this, you are ignoring the law, you will enforce it. Mm-hmm. They should go and do it. They've refused several times now. It's disgusting. We do have race-based policing in Ontario. Saying that gets me in trouble. But I'm not going to stop saying it because it's true. I can point to the areas where it's true, whether it's Whatcott and the blockade of the road leading to the De Beers mine, Caledonia, I believe it was out towards in eastern Ontario, towards Tyandaga. This has happened time and again. And this is 3 OPP commissioners, because remember Caledonia started off with Gwen Boniface. She made a complete mess of it. Julian Fantino was brought in to clean it up. He didn't. Mm-hmm. He may have stopped some problems from happening, but he didn't stop this problem. He allowed that to continue. and now Chris Lewis. That is shameful, and this should be an issue in the next election, but I don't know that any of the politicians have the courage to raise it.
Speaking of politicians, yesterday we had a decision by the Supreme Court of Canada which basically upheld the hate provisions in the Human Rights Act.
Mm-hmm.
They changed the wording a little bit for the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, but basically they confirmed that Canada, you do not have free speech, in my personal opinion, because groups are now protected rather than individuals. The Conservative government, with a stroke of a pen, can change that.
No, not the Saskatchewan part.
No,
This
not
is the tricky
Saskatchewan.
part. We're in the middle of...
But they can get rid of the Human Rights Commission, the federal one, and the tribunal federally.
Well, what they've done federally is Brian Storseth, Conservative MP, brought in a private member's bill to strip away Section 13, and that's the hurt feelings on the internet provision of the Canadian Human Rights Act.
Mm-hmm.
That passed the House of Commons about 9 months ago, roughly, 9 months ago. It hasn't gone forward. It's been sitting in the Senate. Senator Doug Findlay has brought it forward. He sponsored it on the Senate side because it's a private member's bill, not a government bill.
Mm-hmm.
Had to find a sponsor in the Senate. Senator Findlay did that. There have been 3 Conservatives who have spoken out against it. Pierre-Claude Nolan, Nancy Ruth, and Noel Kinsella, who's the Speaker, who wasn't so much speaking out against it as saying, here's some possible problems if this goes forward for you to think about. The other 2 were definitely against getting rid of this provision. But the Liberals in the Senate are not in favor of changing it. There's a bunch more Conservatives in the Senate not in favor of changing it. So it's kind of stalled. Provincially, this should be changed by the various governments, but I don't know that it will be. And the wording in Saskatchewan is replicated, I believe, in Alberta and British Columbia. So here's what the Supreme Court decision ultimately means, though. They actually said truth is no defense. They said just because a statement is true doesn't mean it can't be filled with hate. And your intent, whether you intended the statements to cause harm, does not matter. And you don't need to prove that harm actually happened. So think about that. You can say something that's true, not mean any harm to anyone, and not cause actual harm. But if somebody complains and says, this causes harm to this protected group, and there's a long list of them, then you're in violation of the Act. And as we've learned from the Canadian human rights system, you don't even have to belong to that particular group to lodge the complaint. So you could say something that is completely true and mean no harm, doesn't matter. You can face punitive fines.
What does that say about our country when you can use a Section 1 of the Constitution like that to strip away our rights?
Well, I've long said that Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms needs to go, and that's the opening section of our charter says you have these rights until we say you don't.
That's basically it.
And so it says that law and courts can strip away your rights. So this Whatcott decision actually said, yes, the Saskatchewan Human Rights Act violates Section 2A and Section 2B of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. That's freedom of religion and freedom of expression. Mm-hmm. It violates both of these, but it's justified.
Yes.
So a Human Rights Act that violates the ultimate human rights legislation of the land is allowed to stand.
They've done it before on several occasions. I think the first one was the RIDE program, Reduce Impaired Driving Everywhere, where they actually came out and said, yes, the RIDE program violates your right not to be arbitrarily detained. But, under Section 1, it's reasonable, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, so the charter essentially means nothing.
It means nothing, yes.
It means absolutely nothing. There's 2 sections in it that should be stripped away. Section 1, which you have these rights until you don't section, and Section 15, where they say that that if it's for affirmative action, they can do whatever they want. Those 2 things completely go against the idea of individual rights and freedoms. Given the way that the courts rule, time and again, we're better off under the old common law system than we are now, because although there's a lot of complaints you can have about Pierre Trudeau, But I think that with the Charter, he actually thought he would strengthen individual rights. And what it's done, instead, is strengthen group rights.
Yes.
Because of the way it has been applied. I don't think that that was his intent. I could be wrong, but I don't think that was his intent. I think that he wanted to emulate certain parts of the U.S. Bill of Rights and also the European interpretation of rights, and he wanted to codify them. I mean, under the old common law system, we shouldn't have needed a charter, but he came from the civil code school. Yeah. He wanted this codified. I think he thought he was trying to improve individual rights. It hasn't happened that way. Instead, we've got collectivist rights.
And, unfortunately, I don't think you and I belong to any of these protected groups.
Well, I'm when I wrote recently about race-based policing, in regards to Attawapiskat and the OPP, somebody wrote back to me and said, well, you're a WASP, so you're fine. The only letter of that applies to me is white. I'm neither Anglo-Saxon nor Protestant, but I am white and I am Christian. And therefore, you're right, it doesn't apply to me. I'm white, I'm a male, and I'm Christian. And I remember the early 90s when a lot of these things started coming to the fore, we would joke that one day white Christian men will be the only people not protected. We're getting to that point. There are moves to add gender expression and gender identity to this. There are moves to say that women should be a protected group. When that happens, white Christian men will be the only group not protected. And why do I add Christian to that? Because religion is part of the protected groups, is because of the interpretation. I had a discussion once with quite an eminent jurist who said, well, Christians can't be discriminated against because they're the majority. And I said, but people say they're Christian, they're not practicing. And the people that are being discriminated against are believing and practicing Christians. And they said, well, you might be onto something, but because Christians are the majority, they can't be discriminated against. It's kind of a Marxist interpretation of law that says there are the oppressed and there are the oppressors. And the oppressors are always the majority, and the majority can never be discriminated against. Tell that to blacks in South Africa during apartheid. The majority can be discriminated against. Yes. And this is the situation that we find ourselves in now in Canada.
Now, you're in London today to hold a book signing for your latest book, which is CBC Exposed. What got you involved in the CBC? Was it, you're not the CBC, you're with the Sun News Network. Was it just you're totally upset over the nonsense that goes on in that corporation? Was there a bit because they're the opposition?
Not for the book, no. Now, when I moved to Montreal and started working alongside people from CBC, I started to see problems at the CBC. I started to see that they're overstaffed. They're not as productive as everybody else. I remember there was going to be a shutdown of there's a bridge in Montreal called the Mercier Bridge that goes from the island to the South Shore, but it lets your car gets off and you're actually on Mohawk territory until you get around the roundabout to get on the highway, and then you're off. But you actually land in Mohawk territory. So every now and again when there's a problem, they say, we're going to shut down the bridge until you listen to us. So my editor said, get in the car, get across there, call me when you get there. And I got across and he said, is it a big story? I said, no, CBC only sent 5 trucks this time. It's a pretty small one. And he laughed. But he knew what I was getting at. That wasn't a lot of vehicles for them to send to an event.
Well, they have a fleet of 758 vehicles or something?
Something to that. It is over 700. CBC is 1/3 of the Canadian Parliamentary Press Gallery. 1/3 to 1/2. They are overrepresented at all kinds of news conferences. This is apparently something that used to really annoy Jean Chrétien as he'd get ready to hold a news conference and he'd watch CBC or after CBC or after CBC or walk in and he's thinking, they're half the news conference. So that was the first thing that started to annoy me. And then as I was working in private radio and watching them use their subsidy to compete and expand, that started to bother me.
You mean step into the territory that was held by private corporations?
Yeah. I mean, right now they're expanding...
Like with pop music.
Pop music, with their music service. Pornography. They're expanding into Hamilton. They're expanding into London. They're expanding into Kitchener. Why? Why do they need to be here? These are all fully serviced media markets. that can access CBC if they want it, but they want to get in local and compete on the local level with them because they want to be all things to all people. So that part annoyed me. And then when I got to Sun, they had this pile of access to information requests that had not been reported on, and they were mostly blank pages. I said, well, I was asked to take over the file, and I said, how come nobody reported on these? And they said, well, because they didn't release anything. I said, well, that's the story. When CBC gets back an access to information request, which any Canadian can file for $5 to say, tell me how you're spending our money. You can file these, but when CBC gets one and the government refuses to say information, it becomes a big story for them, and they demand to know why the government's being secretive. So I turned the tables and used their tactic on them, and they didn't like it. They were in the middle of fighting the Federal Information Commissioner in court, and I found it was the height of arrogance for CBC President Hubert Lacroix, Hubie as I affectionately call him on air, that he said, no, he went before a committee of MPs, the people that vote on his billion-dollar subsidy, and he said to them, only a judge can tell us what to release. No, you're talking to Parliament. Mm-hmm. You're talking to what is actually the highest court in the land, because Parliament can, when they have the cojones to do it, overrule any court in the country. And these are the people that give you your money that you frivolously spend. And he told them only a judge can tell us what to release. He then told me that he was going to challenge this, the Information Commissioner, all the way to the Supreme Court. So you'd have a federally funded body fighting another federally funded body in a federally funded court, and the only loser's the taxpayer. Yeah. The Federal Information Commissioner is actually doing her job in challenging them. They lost, but they didn't challenge it all the way to the Supreme Court because my reporting had made it politically impossible for them to do it. A committee of MPs had started to investigate how they were handling the situation, and so
it sounds as if his nickname shouldn't be Hubie, but rather Hubris.
Hubris would be a good one,
because there sounds to be quite the arrogance that you'd only get from a Liberal.
He has a disdain for the little people that want answers to questions. I wouldn't put it past him to use that same disdain on his own reporters, but his own reporters, quite rightly, when the government refuses to give them information, they ask the same questions that I do. Mm-hmm. By the way, they don't like it when I don't call them for a story, but when I do call them, their PR people are quite good, but it's not as if Hubie will actually get back to me and answer anything. No. Their PR people, I have to say, for all the headaches I've caused them, very professional.
You go through a number of indiscretions in this book, CBC Exposed. Everything from smear campaigns against good people, the tearing down of people simply because they're successful and rich. They don't seem to like that kind of a person, so they destroy them. Conservative bashing. Yep. Brian Mulroney was a target of the CBC witch hunt against him. It sounds as if solely because he's a conservative.
And Brian Mulroney, for a lot of Canadians, is a tough man to like. And I get that. But the fact of the matter is, we had 15 years of non-stop CBC investigation. We've had several RCMP investigations. We've had a public inquiry. We've had a lawsuit. And the only thing we found out at the end of it was that Brian Mulroney had bad judgment in who he was doing business with. That was something we knew before all those millions were spent. And at the end of the Oliphant Commission, looking into his dealings with Karl-Heinz Schreiber, CBC said, look at all the millions wasted on this, and we don't know anything else. And I thought, yeah, what about the millions you've wasted running a 15-year parallel prosecution of the man? You're not getting anything more on him. Do we know the whole story? Probably. Then again, maybe we don't. But when you've spent the time and resources that they have, if you can't come up with anything else, it's time to move on.
Speaking of millions, quite literally billions of dollars wasted with the CBC, you go through a litany of rather padded expense accounts of the senior executives there.
Yeah.
I remember, and you mentioned it, isn't it, Bev Oda, a $16 glass of orange juice. Now, Bev Oda, of course, was a conservative minister. And they picked on it and made it a #1 story in the country, and yet you compare that to a resort that the CBC executive went to, spending how much was it on the alcohol? $1,400 or something like that?
Yeah, I'd have to open the book and look at it, but they spent more on alcohol than a lot of people spend on groceries in a month, and there were 8 of them.
And that was for a 2-day conference.
Yeah.
Yeah, for 8 people.
Yeah, so it was an incredible amount. They had flights that would cost $5,000 to go from Montreal to Paris.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't think that you have to jam yourself into an Air Transat charter if you are expected to go to Paris for business and be ready for business
Mm-hmm.
when you get there. I travel enough for work now that I do understand the benefit of not always being jammed at the back of the airplane next to the toilet. But there's somewhere in between. There's got to be somewhere in between the $299 charter that might have 3 stops along the way and a $5,000 ticket, and then the best hotels when you arrive.
Now you're calling for the sale of the CBC, and in the book you give a number of different ways that people can persuade the government to do just that. What do you think your chances are for something like that to happen?
Well, I don't think that they would put it up for sale. But I think if somebody came forward with an offer, that they would seriously entertain it. I think much like the Air Canada Canadian Airlines merger that nobody was really talking about, and then an offer was made and Chrétien had to do something. I mean, Air Canada was already sold off, but there were legal things around who could own it and what could happen. I think if somebody came forward and said, we want to buy CBC, here's an offer, here's how we're going to do it, here's who we are, I think the government would take it seriously and give it due consideration. I think that selling it rather than cutting its budget is the answer. If you cut the budget, it's still around. And we're still paying for it, and it continues to have all the problems it has. CBC, why would you shut it down? It is an entity that has some value. You could sell it off. The lawsuits that they put up with, the bias, the wasting of money, all of that would cease to be a public policy issue if we didn't pay for it.
As you say in your book, who would care how many fleets of vehicles they have, or how many staff reporters they have at the scrums, if it was not public money? Mm-hmm. That's the issue, isn't it? It's just the taxpayers' dollars and the complete and utter waste of it. That's
absolutely.
Yeah. So it sounds as if selling might be a very palatable thing, I think, that the public would go for, especially since very few people listen or watch the CBC, according to some of the ratings that I've seen. As little as 9% in some markets. Apparently the CBC don't even care about the ratings, what you're mentioning in here.
They're schizophrenic about them. Some people, like Richard Stursberg, devote a whole chapter to. Mm-hmm. He said, he was hired and he said, let's make CBC relevant. Let's put on things that are Canadian, that reflect Canadian culture, that will get people watching. And he had a revolt on his hands.
He ended up getting fired, didn't he?
Yeah, he got the boot. Because CBC doesn't know what to do about ratings. So they're supposed to speak to all Canadians and tell Canadian stories. But if you leave them to their own devices, they tell things that only matter to people in downtown Toronto, or downtown Montreal, or downtown Vancouver, and the rest of the country can go pound salt.
They're very elitist.
You can find, very much so, you can find a clip on their website in the CBC archives of back then he was a young MP named Doug Fisher. I might have gone by Douglas then. Doug Fisher went on to become one of the deans of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. He was a Toronto Sun columnist from day one, and great writer. But he's a young CCF MP from Thunder Bay, and he's being interviewed in the early 60s, denouncing the metropolitanism of CBC, that they don't care about the rest of the country, that they only care what happens in the downtown centers. That was in the early 60s. Nothing's changed.
50 years and we still have the CBC as a bunch of very Toronto-centric elitists.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to expand into London and take away from the companies that are struggling to tell stories of Londoners here. But do they really care what happens in London? No, you're not going to see stories from here end up on their national newscasts. I mean, but if something happens in downtown Toronto, it's all the buzz on radio and television. And you can say the same for every city across the country that they're going to expand into. It's absolutely mind-boggling to me that they're being allowed to do this.
It's a good book. You've exposed the CBC quite properly, and I hope that there is some traction with the public, and we can finally get rid of that mother corp. Brian Lilley, thank you very much.
Thank you.